Hello and welcome to another installment on my Python for Beginners series. In this video we're going to be talking about IDE choices. So let's start by actually clarifying what an IDE is. IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment. And an integrated development environment generally has three areas. The first of them is syntax highlighting. In this image here on the blog, we can see that print is in purple, then we've got the brackets are in black, and this quoted text is in green. That's the process of syntax highlighting. It also has IntelliSense or predictive coding. We'll come on to what that is as we go through the video. And then we also look at debugging, which again I'll do a practical demonstration of, but they're the three consistent components of an integrated development environment. Okay, now we're going to start with idle. There are a few reasons we're starting with idle. The first is that this is the one that we've used up to this point in this video series and in the blog series. The second reason, which is also the same reason I chose it to start the series with, it's packaged with Python. So when you install Python on your system, it's available to everybody that has Python installed. Okay, so, and we're going to use this same little bit of code throughout this whole video. But before I go too far, I'm just going to copy that code. Right, so file, new file, save as, because as with everything else in idle and Python, it needs to be specifically saved. So source, repos, there we go. I'm then going to split the screen. Ignore the yellow line. That will update shortly. That's just because I was doing testing before I made the video. Okay, so this piece of code, all it does, if I run it first, it asks the user for an input for their name and it stores it in the variable name. And then, although we haven't directly done selection yet or if and else, what this is saying is if the value that is stored in name is exactly the same as the quoted text, run this code. If it's not exactly the same, run this code. And I'll just show you that first. So in this case, it's output you are must pay because it's compared that correctly. If I run that again, and I change that, even if I just change one character, it tells me because it's not exactly the same. All right, so let's look at the syntax highlighting. That's this bit. This bit here, well, we can see it's all broken up. And once again, we've got a different colour for the if statement and for the else statement. Breaks up the code, makes it easier to see. And this also works while we're typing, because if I just duplicate this now, and we can see that as soon as I type the input, it turns green. As soon as I put the quotes on, if you watch that carefully, when I do one, it's thinking this is all part of the quote. I've closed the quote and it's black. Okay, so syntax highlighting is really useful while you're writing your code because you can see if you've hit a command, you can see if chances are that you've missed a quotation mark, and you can see whether you've used an existing Python command without being aware. Okay, so the next one that we want to look at is predictive text. And unfortunately, IDLE doesn't do any kind of predictive coding. Okay, so if I minimize, just let me copy this code first. This is just talking about differences in different IDEs. I'm going to come across to PyCharm first to talk about IntelliSense and predictive coding. Now, PyCharm is a professional level IDE and is more complicated to get used to using initially. When you first load it, I can just click New Project, and straight away you can see how many options it's giving. But actually, if all you want to use it for is Python, you just need to leave it on the default. You need to be aware of where it's going to create your project. Usually you don't need to change anything here. And these are just things, mostly you don't have to change it. You just have to be aware. And typically you'll need to put inherit from global packages. They are installed for you by default with Python. Looks complicated, but it is just a case of remembering to click inherit global site packages. And we can choose to or not to create the default script. I'm going to leave that there. Delete the contents of the default script and replace it. It's exactly the same as what we've had already. So that's the script that we're working with, or the Python code. Now, as you can see, the name is still in black, but we've got a different color here. Each IDE is different like this, and actually one of the benefits of most of the other IDEs over IDLE is that you have more control over this. For example, if I go to File and then I go to Manage IDE Settings, we can import and export our settings. So we can move them from machine to machine easily and keep consistent. And I have some default appearances that I can work with. And these are just predetermined suggestions. You can create your own, you can add to these. You can do that to an extent in IDLE, but it is only for the colouring of each section. It doesn't include background, it doesn't include suggestions for contrast. Now, I did say that this was going to be talking about the IntelliSense, and I'm going to start by deleting this and typing print. Now, the first thing you'll notice, actually I'm going to slow that down, because even just typing P, I've got the option. It thinks that the print command is the most likely thing I want. If I hit return, it'll infill print. It's already put my open and closed parentheses in place. And now I can either type the quotes if I wanted to do it like that, or I can type the name of an existing variable. So if I just put N, it's already detected the fact that we had name on the previous line. It's already defined variable. I hit the enter key and it's done. This is IntelliSense, and it is a really, really helpful feature. And this is something idle just doesn't do at all, I'm afraid. And neither does Thonny. Thonny is another one that we're going to look at, because Thonny is a basic IDE that's set up for beginners. If I just copy this code in here, once again we can see that the syntax highlighting is in place, but it works with slightly different colours again. It does have a set of options, and it does have a number of predefined themes. It's already doing better than idle. If I just pull the idle window back up, in comparison, if I go to configure idle, I can control each of these individually, which I can do in the others, but there's no predefined theme at all. You're just left on your own to define it all. Unfortunately, Thonny doesn't do any kind of IntelliSense, so if I did another print statement here, it doesn't fill in the parentheses for me, and there's no suggestions. When it comes to the debugging, which we'll look at soon, it is far better than idle, but all the same, it's nothing like PyCharm, and I'm about to show you the comparison with Visual Studio Code and also with Visual Studio. Let's start with Visual Studio Code. File, new file, the Python file. Just going to save that to the same place. Yep. Okay. Just like in PyCharm, we've got the ability to change the themes. So if I go to Preferences and then Color Theme, we can choose between a whole range of them. This is the default for Visual Studio Code, but there's an entire range that we can work with. And you can see the colouring changes with the themes. This is actually one way in which Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code are better than PyCharm. There is a greater number of themes available by default. And it does support or have IntelliSense. So if I start by doing that line, and then I do it brings up print straight away. It doesn't fill in the brackets, but if I do the open parentheses, it automatically fills in the closing parentheses that's required to go with it. If I put in the first quote, if I wanted to do an exact string, it puts in the second quote for me and places the cursor in the middle. And when I type in the N for name, we can see it's here, but actually it's not choosing it as the first option, so it's possibly less friendly because I've got to either press down twice on the cursor key or move my hand to the mouse and double click. It is nearly as good. And the interface is more complicated than Thonny or idle, but actually it's less complicated than PyCharm. Okay, so let's go for the look at Visual Studio. Now, Visual Studio is Microsoft's professional level IDE. It's equivalent to PyCharm for Python. The biggest difference is that PyCharm is specifically focused on Python, although it supports other stuff. Its focus is Python. Visual Studio doesn't have a specific focus. It is a multi-language IDE. Okay, so it's going to create that. Once again, there was more options to fulfill at the start. We had to specifically set a place. It creates project files. It doesn't just create a single py file. Let's copy paste that code to start with. Syntax highlighting is supported. Again, there are a number of different themes that we can choose from. And it has more than PyCharm and about the same as VsCode. So in that respect, for Python, these are about equal. It also supports IntelliSense, so if I type in P, but I've got to type the R. So sometimes Visual Studio as a full version, because it's actually offering more to an enhanced developer, doesn't give the obvious stuff as easily. If I start that again, it's there, but it's not. Look, I've got to go 4 levels down now. Now, that's not to say that the other parts are irrelevant. They could be as you advance. But once again, it hasn't filled in our parentheses. It will do these bits automatically and double them up for me and delete them as a pair. Now, if I type in name, well, interesting, because where is it? And this can happen with the full version of Visual Studio. There are a huge amount of options in there. And it is assuming that if you're using the full version of Visual Studio, that you're a professional developer, or at least not an absolute beginner, and that you'll know that needs to be an exact match. And it's showing you a lot of the more advanced options, the things it can do that the VsCode version cannot do. There are strong arguments for learning how to use Visual Studio. It is probably the biggest IDE around. However, some of that multi-language support and professional level is working against itself. Okay, so we're going to start now take a look at debugging. We're going to come back to Thonny first. The original code back in. Now, debugging lets us run through line by line to see what's happening in the code, what's being executed at any one time. And the first stage is to set a breakpoint, which I can do in here by left-clicking. In fact, no. Let me show you this first, and then I'll show you why idle doesn't really support this. It kind of does, but it's not like what you're about to see. Now, if I click debug, let's just make that a bit bigger so it's easier for you to read. Oh. Save as. Okay, so debug. It's now highlighted that first line, and that was because we set the breakpoint here. This is a breakpoint, and it just sets the point at which the code will stop. If I'd set it here, it would have run this first line and then it would have stopped. And we have a few options open to us now that were not open to us a minute ago. First one is step over, step into, step out, and resume. The only two we're going to really look at today are step over and step into. Step into is detailed. In this line here, we are setting a string which is going to perform part of an input statement asking for the input. That the result of that input is then stored into a variable called name. So if I step into, we can see it doing that bit, and then actually it looks at just the string. It's set that, and it comes down here and it asks for the name. Oh, got to press the enter key. It tells us it's set that as must pain, and we can keep going. Then says we have this entire thing to declare first. So we're going to check that part of the code. We retrieve what's in name. The value in name is must pain. And we're checking to see if it's equivalent to must pain. We've established that it is true, it is, so it will come into the next code block. And again, it'll break down the print statement. And the output is answered here. Right, let's compare that to step over and do that again. This time it hasn't done any of the breaking down of this, it's just treated this as one line of code. And if I step over this one, it will just output the result and won't show us any of that, because in that case it had highlighted this whole block and we've got to step over, so it hasn't done any of the breakdown whatsoever in that, it's just output the result. Let's have a look at that in idle, because it's really not as nice. First thing we need to do is start by turning on debugging. So we're going to go to debugger. I'm going to drag this up a bit so that we can see the debug window and the shell. So with debugging turned on, I can then go to run and run module. Oh, I haven't set a breakpoint yet, sorry. So I can right click, that's a right click on the line, set breakpoint. This is where this highlights, but there is a slight problem in that it's a little bit persistent, doesn't, and seems to come back. So run module. Okay, so we're down here and we've got step and over, just like we had in Thonny. But if I click step, we can see what it's doing, but it's all a little bit unclear. And eventually it does come to do the same point, but this is not easy to work with. Now I'm just going to finish this off now. So it's just not as nice. It's not as user-friendly. And as you progress further into your Python coding, that will become more and more important. And the fact that that is so hard to follow, so hard to understand, because you're just dealing with these little lines of text, idle becomes essentially unusable at that point for anything more than the very first stages of learning your Python code. So we have covered syntax highlighting. We've looked at the options for light and dark and high contrasts in PyCharm, Thonny, Visual Studio, VsCode. We've looked at the fact that Thonny is a much better debugger than IDE, but I'm about to show you the comparison with Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code and then PyCharm. So if I just get my code back, let's start with Visual Studio Code. Very similar way to Thonny, we left click to set a breakpoint. We get a dot here. I can go to run and start debugging. It will then give me a choice of options, and I'm just going to choose debug the current active Python file. And what it's given us is largely the same option. So I've got step over, step into, this out, restart, stop, but we're just going to focus on these two for now. Step over works exactly the same way as it did in Thonny. So we'll come here, it'll ask me to enter the name. And if I step over, it comes down to this line. I said exactly the same. That's actually a slight difference. It hasn't evaluated the entirety of this. It said we've evaluated this, and I come here, step over once more, and it'll output. What it's not done is evaluated this as an entirety. It's broken it down one step further. Now, I personally think that's better. You could argue either way on that score. However, I'm going to rerun this because I want to show you the difference with step into. Remember, in Thonny, this did every tiny last minute detail. So this one has just gone straight for asking me for my name. I'm just going to put me this time just to show the difference. And so if I step into, it says it's not equal to Ms. Payne, so we're going to come to this code, and it's going to step over. Now what I want to bring your attention to here is this frame skipped from debugging during step in. Note, may have been skipped because option to default equals true. That looks confusing. It really does. That is not a clear message. What it means is that there is an option that you can turn on so that rather than just looking at what should be obvious from the code you've typed, you can make it go down into every last little detail like it did in Thonny. So VsCode is offering us the choice. It can do it in a way that it considers to be the most likely or an intelligent approach, or we can turn on, we want to see every tiny little stage. Let's have a look at Visual Studio next. Slightly different to set a breakpoint. We're back to a right click and setting a breakpoint. Once again, we can see there's a lot more options here. And the other difference is that our debug or release is here, and we just click start. The next big difference is that Visual Studio always works this sort of thing in a separate console window. So what we end up with is two windows side by side. Again, we've got step into, step over. This will work exactly the same actually as it did in VsCode, except it's working in a separate console window. And it doesn't actually make it as easy to see. We can hover over to say that name and we can see the value is must-pain, but it didn't make it as clear to see as VsCode actually did. Again, sorry, I clicked the one, but now it's going to print you are that, and it's going to exit. I'm just going to stop and rerun that. This time I'm just going to use step into. Press the enter key, back to step into. It's step down, and we've got this message, which is almost the same as VsCode, and is just saying we can turn this option on and off to use intelligent debugging that just looks at the code on the screen, or to actually break that right down. And the last of our offerings is PyCharm. With PyCharm, there is a difference. We're back to left clicking here to set the breakpoint. And the way we start is a little bit different again. We've got a play button that will just run something without debugging. And then we've got the debug symbol that will run it with debugging. If I come down to the debugger, this time we've got an extra option, and I like this. I think this is a real win point for PyCharm, because I have got step into, or I have step into my code, meaning it's going to use the intelligent approach. So at any point, as a developer, while I'm coding and debugging, I can choose which style I want for any particular piece of code while I'm stepping through it. That is something that none of the other IDEs I've looked at offer. So I'm going to use a sensible one. And here is where actually I think PyCharm has a slight fail. I need to see the debug window. And then I need to click on console, not debugger. Again, it's a professional level IDE, and to somebody that's used to doing that, it's fairly obvious. To a new coder, that might not be obvious. Oh, I can type in the answer again. Hit return. This bit, however, in my opinion, is a real win for PyCharm and JetBrains generally. It's told me straight away with a different colour highlight something has changed, and it's told me the value that's been stored into the variable name. It tells me which I'm going to run next, like the others, and it exits. For this reason, in my opinion, the king or the queen of the coders for Python is PyCharm. It is not a simple, easy to use piece of software. But once you go beyond your first few pieces of code, it is well worth the time to learn how to use it. The same is true of VsCode and Visual Studio. But for working with Python, PyCharm is my IDE of choice, and it's the one I would be putting my time into learning. Let's have a look at the blog, just check I haven't missed anything. No, this video is an accompaniment to this blog, and it's just easier to show some of these things on a video. Walk through. And we've done the summary. Oh, yeah, one last thing to point out. Thonny is open source, not closed. It's open source. It's available on GitHub. It does syntax highlighting just like IDLE. It also has an attempt at debugging, but the debugging isn't user-friendly. That, in my opinion, is quite a mistake for an IDE that's aimed at beginners. Visual Studio Code is probably the second stage to go for after IDLE and Thonny. It has a nice debugger, and it has nice IntelliSense options where it's letting you choose the next bit. But it isn't as nice to use as PyCharm. And the full version of Visual Studio is worth learning. It really is, as you migrate to different languages. It is the gold standard for C++ and for C#. However, it is only really a Windows IDE. There is a Mac version of Visual Studio, but it is limited. There is no Linux version of Visual Studio at all. VsCode is cross-platform. It's available on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It has extensions for virtually every language. Python is actually really well supported. The extension is very good. That isn't consistent. Some languages are better served than others. Once you migrate past programming in a single file, you will start to see the limitations of VsCode. It isn't designed for working with projects. It kind of does it, but realistically, if you're going to make a Python project, or any other language for that matter, with multiple coding files, you need a full IDE. Visual Studio Code is a lightweight offering. It does a lot. It's very good, but where you're going to, oops, didn't mean to delete the Visual Studio icon, where you're going to end up for Python in the end will be PyCharm or Visual Studio. I think PyCharm is the better of the two. Other people will argue that opinion, but I hope that this little video has given some guide to new users about some of the differences between the different IDEs and why, as you move further and progress in your Python code, you will find it easier to migrate away from idle into one of the others. VsCode is probably a good first step. I'm going to do further video and blog posts on actually setting up PyCharm and setting up Visual Studio Code as well as Visual Studio. I hope it's been useful. It is related to this blog post on the screen now. Thank you for watching. Bye.